Hello and welcome back. After the huge success of the mini-series on Queen Mary I, I invited back Dr. Johanna Strong, and she has brought to us another great topic. I hope you enjoy.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Welcome to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast miniseries on Queenship. I am your host, Dr. Johanna Strong, and in this series we are traveling through time and around the world to learn more about global queenship. In today's episode, I am joined by Jessica Storoschuk and Dr. Françoise Le Jeune to find out more about queenship in the British Empire, focusing on Victoria and her relationship with Canada and India and Africa. Jess is a historian of monarchy focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries. Her main research topics include the Canadian monarchy, royal tours, and representations of the monarchy in the press. She also works for the news site Royal Central and has a website that focuses on making history and culture broadly accessible. And you can visit that website at anhistorianabouttown.com. Françoise is Professor of British and Canadian History at the Université de Nantes. She is a specialist of the Victorian British Empire and has published widely on society and politics in Canada and its relation to the British Empire. If you thought you could get through a queenship series with me without talking about Canada, you have once again misunderestimated me. So, let's get into today's episode. So thank you so much both for joining me. And I want to get started really in looking at why you got interested in queenship, especially queenship and the British Empire. So Françoise, let's start with you on this one.
All right, many thanks, Johanna, for your invitation and to talk about queenship and Queen Victoria particularly. Well, for me, it is a long story, but I'll make it very short. It all began when I was working on my PhD, and that's about 30 years ago. That's to tell you how old I am. I was already focusing on the British Empire, and I chose to study what is now called settler colonialism in British Columbia. And it's the most western province of Canada, as many of you know, of course. But at the time, it was called the last jewel of the crown in Canada. And it was the perfect example of a colonial project orchestrated or launched from Britain in the 1840s. So at the very beginning of Victoria's reign, obviously. Part of my research was based on a series of family correspondences written by middle-class settlers, British settlers, residing in Victoria, the new capital city of the colony, and most of the letters that were written then by usually the women, obviously, writing home to their family, mentioned the Queen at some point. So all these bourgeois ladies were usually inquiring about the Queen, about, her courtship, and then the family was growing, and so forth and so on. And in most of their papers, I also came across, those daguerreotypes that were made of Albert and Victoria, copies of those. And there were also newspaper clippings describing how the Queen was dressed and how they could copy the Queen's dresses when she was on such and such outings, and so forth and so on. So I think that the desire to imitate, to emulate the royal couples, and this fascination for Queen Victoria was in my research from day one. And I felt that this was at the core of the sentimental link, obviously, that was connecting those British settlers to home. At the time, the people living in Victoria was called more English than the English themselves. But I mean, even through the second generation, there was this love for the Queen. I remember also working on this episode, and maybe Jessica will talk about it as well, when Princess Louise, Victoria's sixth child, visited British Columbia. At that time, she was living in Ottawa. Her husband was the Marquis of Lorne, Governor General, appointed by the Queen, and she visited the West and stayed a couple of days in Victoria. She was the talk of the town. I mean, though he was taking precedence over her, all the ladies in the letters I read were really prepping up for the day when they would see Princess Louise. So there was major craze. She was called the daughter of so great and good monarch, the daughter of our beloved sovereign, and they had to be seen, to be visible, and to see Louise at this point. So this was in fact the beginning of all my, the story I had with Queen Victoria, because how come that by proxy, Queen Victoria was able to foster such a demonstration of devotion, fealty? This I needed to decipher and to understand, but it took me many, many years, in fact, through lectures and seminars before, in fact, I began looking at Queen Victoria. And it's only recently, a couple of years back, that that I started working on that book that I'm actually working on now, because the students kept asking me, how come there's no book on Queen Victoria and her empire? What did she think really about the settlers, in Canada? So this is what I talk about, and I might answer some of your questions today.
It's always amazing to me when we think about how big the British Empire is in Victoria's reign, just what a grasp she has on it, even in places that she's never been to or has never kind of seen firsthand. But that, as you say, she sends these proxies to support her power. And she's kind of so loved around, by settlers. It's so loved around the world. It's just amazing, that kind of authority that she has.
Mm-hmm. But even I noted that when Louise visited the West, for instance, there were also some Indian chiefs or indigenous chiefs, if you like. There were some Chinese workers. They all had to address something to the Queen. Well, we've seen this before because we have colleagues who work on the same thing in Australia. But they were fascinated by the way the Queen was above the state. That as if, in the letters, they're asking her to protect them against some sort of dominion or some sort of even settler colonialism, as if she had that power to reach them out over, sort of hovering over the land as it was done previously, I guess, by George III when he protected the indigenous tribes as well. So, but it was lingering, still at the end of the 19th century. So,
absolutely, and that really builds into today, this conversation of the Canadian federal government doesn't kind of speak with Indigenous nations. Those aren't their equals. The equal is the crown. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to see that that's something that hasn't changed from Victoria's time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Jess, what about you? What got you interested in queenship and in kind of the Queen's roles in Canada?
So my answer is, I suspect, similar to many people who were born in the late 80s or perhaps early 90s. There was a children's book series that came out called the Royal Diaries, where it was each book was a different royal from a different area or time period, and it usually was when they are a teenager. Victoria is one of them, but I started reading these and I was fascinated by them, and there was a section at the end of each book that actually had sources. Granted, they were appropriate for third and fourth grade readers, but they were gave kind of photographs, and there was pieces of letters and things, and I was so fascinated by it, and ended up going to the library to find more biographies, and this was the 90s. So I ended up reading a lot of adult biographies of these people when I was 11, 12, but that got me started, and then in university, I did all of my degrees are in history. At the undergrad level, my professors were more, the department was more of a socialist department, so kind of steered slightly away from monarchy. So my degrees are focusing in Irish history, but I was always came back to the history of monarchy. And then when I decided to continue on my own research, and I kept coming back to this question of the Crown's role in Canada, and especially the fact that so much of Canada's history, post 1867, we have had a queen. Two queens have dominated Canada's, we'll say, modern history, and just the role that takes. And something that struck me pretty much the whole time I've been reading any sort of historical sources is the emphasis placed on men. So I remember in high school when we learned about Queen Victoria, it was mostly about Sir Johnny MacDonald. And Victoria was just kind of there in the background. And I understand he also played a very important role. The government is important, but it was just, she was always presented as, oh, she's just kind of there. She just happens to be there. And the more you poke into it, as I'm sure Françoise will say, she wasn't just there. She just didn't just happen to be there. And even Queen Elizabeth II during her reign, very different from Victoria's position, but still played a different role, but still an active role. So just, I've always been long fascinated that people assume, especially, I don't know if people just hear Queen and assume, oh, they're in the background. And even people reduce the role of a consort, and what they can do and the things that they accomplish and everything. But especially in the cases of Victoria and Elizabeth and Canada, they did a lot. They accomplished a lot and they were involved in a lot, both good and bad. And so I keep coming back to that and mulling over that.
It is a particularly complex relationship, and we'll hear this later in the series as well when we talk. Jess is back on talking to me, and we're joined by Dr. Cindy McCreary talking about this relationship in Oceania and Canada and kind of how these Indigenous crown relationships happen and just how complex they are. And we're going to talk as well. I know you do a lot of work on royal tours. That's going to be in the later episode as well. So please do, listeners, stick around for that one when it comes out. And I will say, Jess, I grew up on I forget what the series is called, but on these Royal Diaries. And I think and Dear Canada, which is a series about Canadian teenage girls living through historic moments. They have a lot to answer for getting people into history.
They do. I also just learned recently, this is an aside, that there's a Dear America series. As a Canadian, obviously we had the Royal Diaries and we had Dear Canada. I just learned there's Dear America. It makes sense. My school did not order those. But yes, and I remember even in the Dear Canada, those were a bit later, but I remember also I read the Queen Victoria Royal Diary, and then the Dear Canada, a few of them also mentioned, like Françoise said, in the settlers' letters. Obviously, these are fictional, but these young girls, and I'm sure they're based on actual people or an amalgamation of people. And these young girls were also mentioned Victoria, and so I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, it's amazing to see kind of where historians start and then where we kind of end up and keep going. And I think that ties us really well in an accidental segue into what you're currently working on. I love hearing about this. Françoise, what is currently on your desk as your priority for work?
Well, my work is on that book I was telling you about, on Queen Victoria and her empire. And the book is about how she understands, how she perceives, those diversities of cultures and ethnic background, how she can be fascinated sometimes or not so interested in some other colonies. So I'm working on her diaries, of course, her letters, and how she was a prolific writer, so it takes forever to read everything. But so it's an ongoing project which I hope to complete in a year or two, because I have to do many things in between. But I love doing it. It's comforting to go back to this. But what you see, of course, is a very egotistic relationship that the Queen builds between, she self-fashioned herself empress in the 1870s, Empress of India, but also Empress of Ireland. We don't know about that, but it's probably the same title. And she has this sort of specific relationship with different colonial territories, but they bring her love, and that's what she loves, actually. So there's a lot of eagerness, I think, as well in the way she wants to possess somehow part of the empire. So I think we'll talk later on about how she brings the empire home, but she collects artifacts, obviously, but also people, colonial subjects in a way. She also asks painters, people who are in capacity to bring sceneries and landscapes, to send them to her. So she is into that sort of collection, and she wants to be surrounded by this. The other angle that I took as well in this book is her political involvement, and this is less known, I think. She was very involved, in fact, in fashioning and making some imperial policies. Even though the English Constitution says she's not allowed to do so, she found, and this is to the consort, Prince Albert, who was, I think it was sort of, that was his idea. She found ways, loopholes to influence the prime ministers, the secretaries of state for the colonies. She always comes up with new plans for the empire, or she always, would describe a plan that is made up by Gladstone or something as not really relevant. So she is involved. She does not hesitate to write directly to her governors everywhere in the colonies by telling them, well, I'm the one who appointed you. So she's going to continue having this sort of close relationship with the men she appoints. This is part, of course, of the prerogative to nominate, but she usually asks them to see them before they go, so that she knows that they're going to have a sort of devotion. And she resorts to that sort of traditional courtly way of saying, well, you have to be dedicated to your queen and ask fidelity from you and loyalty. And it works, because many of these men do write letters to her, bringing her fresh information, as she says, which sometimes she can use as a sort of power of leverage to tell her ministers, well, look, this is not the information I got. This man wrote directly to me, his queen, and this is the information I have. So she that's very interesting. This queenship that she uses is I think fascinating. And there's another example which I find interesting as well, when she at the end of her reign, when they are going to Africa to colonize, part of Eastern Africa mostly, she wants to keep in touch with the commanders in the field, but she never knows how to get to them directly because that's not her prerogative. So she would work through their wives. She would write to the wives and start a relationship, and then eventually she gets to the men. So, that's her way of doing things. So that's what I'm fascinated by, actually. She is very involved. Actually, we don't know her much as a Queen of England. She rarely fashioned England in her. People loved her for who she was, wanted to live like her, maybe, but she never was interested in the fate of her own people as much as she was about, people abroad or overseas. So that's what I'm working on now.
Yeah, and as you say, this self-fashioned idea of empress, I was trying to think kind of back. I generally pride myself on knowing about British queens, and I thought I had forgotten that she was also Empress of Ireland. But I was also at an exhibit at the Canadian History Museum on the shipwreck, the Empress of Ireland. I thought, that should have gone together, that who is the ship named after, but it did not click in my brain until you said it. Oh, I'm sure hopefully many listeners are looking forward to when your book is out in the world. Hopefully you will have many people reading it. I'm excited to see those ideas come out into the world.
Okay, thank you.
And Jess, I know we've recorded a later episode already, and so listeners will get to hear this again in a few weeks' time. But what is currently on your slate of research items you're working on?
Yeah, just a side note before I start, because I lived in Ireland, that is not something that they celebrate a lot, understandably. A very complex history with the monarchy in Ireland. But yes, it's always fascinating that she was Empress of Ireland, and it's always kind of downplayed to everything else. But yes, in terms of my own projects, I've got 2 research streams going. So in the first, most people don't know this, but I am a ballet dancer myself. So I am actually looking at representations of historic queens on the stage. So currently I've started with the Northern Ballet's Victoria. So I'm looking at how Victoria is actually portrayed in this ballet and what characteristics they're giving her and just how that comes across through the choreography, through the performance, etc. And then we also have, for example, we have this arena in Asia, and there are a few other examples I'm drawing on. So that's a really interesting area I'd never really thought about before, these other portrayals, because a lot of people work understandably on television and film portrayals, but we see less in the theater. Less work has been done on what happens in the theater, especially in ballet. So that's been really interesting. And my other project is I'm looking at royal tours to Canada from 1901 to 1977. So I kind of go from the end of Victoria's death to Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee. And it's surprisingly relevant, especially now because everyone's asking after the coronation, where will Charles and Camilla be going? The family needs to get out there and do their Commonwealth tours, but a lot of the discussion here right now is who will go where, who is going to be the quote unquote best messenger and best interaction. And so looking at royal tours and really how those are represented in the press and what the responses are. I'm currently just I pick a tour and then work on that. It seems to be the best way to wrap my head around it. And I started focusing on the larger tours only because we have these smaller tours, like the Duke of Kent is a very short tour in 1942, but it's a few days. It's during the war. It does get press coverage, obviously, but not as much. And there's not as many. I can't compare across provinces and across different journals. So I'm currently working on major tours. I'm looking at the George VI and Elizabeth's tour right before the war. That was a major tour to Canada. So that's currently what I'm working on.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think one thing that listeners may not realize is we talk about how big the empire is. And as Jess says, it's hard on a 1 or 2 day tour of Canada to go everywhere. And kind of putting that in perspective, if you're wanting to fly from one side of the country to the other, it's at least 5 hours on a plane. So we're talking about a vast expanse of territory here, which will really come in. If that's how big Canada is, think about how big the entire empire would be to travel in a day before planes. So keep that in mind, kind of listeners, as we go forward talking about how queens relate to the British Empire. And Jess, you're not off the hot seat for a second. I want also to ask about how kind of your own position and perspective. We've talked a little bit about obviously the complexities between settler and Indigenous relationships. How does your own position as kind of a white female scholar affect how you look at queenship and how you look at this interaction with the empire?
So that's a very relevant question, especially being here in Canada. So I'm in Winnipeg, which is in Manitoba. If you fold the map in half, we're pretty much the dead center of Canada. We have a very high Indigenous population in our province. I believe we have one of the highest. And I also work at a university, and it's in an administrative role. And I'm grateful that our university, we've done a lot of work on truth and reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation project is centered at the University of Manitoba, where I work. And so I am very cognizant of my position. And when I read older histories, oftentimes Indigenous communities are sometimes left out. Sometimes they're treated as kind of a circus type of attraction. The queen or the queen's representative or whomever saw them and the chiefs were wearing whatever. But there is a lot more thoughtful scholarship happening. In my own work, I absolutely look at that. And it's really interesting to see in the press on tours how their interactions with Indigenous communities are reported. How are they reported? What does that look like? But I also recognize that I am not at the center of that story. So I do try to be mindful and not speak for Indigenous people and their histories. So I do everything to look at it and bring it in because I think it is a very important piece of the Canadian history puzzle, if you will, but also not to speak for other communities.
Absolutely. And it is, I know I've said this a lot, but it is such a complicated relationship, but it's so important, for all of us as scholars to really be looking at how our own backgrounds and our own experiences influence how we see history and how we approach it. Françoise, how about you? How does kind of your perspective, your background influence the work that you do?
Same thing. I'm teaching. Most of my seminars are on contemporary Canada, the history of Canada, and whenever I teach a course, even on Victoria's Empire, half of it is dedicated to the Indigenous perspective, or at least the others basically in the story. So I stay away for half the class from the master narrative that is always triumphant, obviously, and I look at the subaltern studies, or again Indigenous studies, and also I try to bring up more of the settler colonialism criticism that is also quite current these days. So I think students in Nantes, at least, they have half of the courses are on Indigenous studies in Canada, and I'm doing my best to open their mind to another perspective on the story as well, on the main story. So,
which is such an important job. I think especially I've noticed it in Britain, is in places where it's not an everyday necessity to look at this relationship. It's so easy to go, we'll look at that later, or, that's another course. That's not what I'm teaching. But I think what you're doing is incredible, that actually we do have to be looking at this, and this difference between a dominant or master narrative and then everyone else's history, which is equally significant. It's just not what the country has decided is the kind of, in massive air quotes, the proper good history. Yeah. And so, Françoise, what is the relationship kind of between Canada and Queen Victoria? I guess we'll hear that. And Jess, if you want to hop in, feel free to. So, Françoise, why don't you start us off?
So my impression is that I wouldn't say that there's a lot of, Canada is interacting in during her reign. I will give you some examples, but if you read her letters, there's not a fascination for the country, or she's not as adamant about, Canada as she is probably about British India. But I think it's more like, generally speaking, about the settlers' colonies. Queen Victoria was not that interested in finding out how her people were doing in the white colonies, let's say. They were more the extension, like a province abroad, if you like. But in the case of Canada, I found that she's interested. Well, she becomes concerned, if you like, by Canada at a very early stage of her reign, because right away she is confronted with a colonial crisis. December 1837, January 1838, there's a series of rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, the equivalent of Central Canada today. They are asking for more responsible government, and she's still young. She's only 18, and bam, she has to deal with that. Well, not her herself, obviously. Prime Minister Lord Melbourne is going to do the job for her, but nonetheless, and I wrote a paper on that, he's going to walk her through all the steps of looking at the maps, telling her what, a constitution in the colonies is, and who are the loyalists, and what are the French Canadians. So she gets a quick lecture on, what is the problem there. She gets to select Lord Durham as well. So she is going to handpick the very first special envoy with, heavy missions to bring back law and order in Canada. And he is devoted to her. So on top of writing his famous report, he's going to write specific letters to the Queen, because he's so pleased to be, chosen by her, that he will report specifically to her. So we have a number of letters that are just for her, and she gets, the gist of what is happening. So I'm not going to continue the story about the Canadian perspective on what happened next, but to me, that's a baptism of fire, which is interesting right at the beginning of her reign. So I don't know how much she understood that Canada was not always those rambunctious or those loud, or it's hard because she never really goes back to the subject after that. The second great moment, I think, that has to do with the history of Canada is the creation of the Dominion, obviously. So for about 4 or 5 years, there are roundtables in the 1860s to prepare the creation of the Confederation. But the last roundtable in London is going to see all the premiers coming to London for discussion with the Colonial Office, and she's going to have them over at Buckingham Palace for dinner. And so for the Canadians, I think that's amazing to be welcomed by the Queen. And at the same time, she's very pleased also of the progress that these people have made. So she is satisfied. She wishes them well. And for her, Canada becomes a sort of emblem of home rule. Remember, home rule is much debated at the time. They get home rule because they are deserving settlers. They work, they know how to work together. They can be trusted. So off they launch them in the world with this dominion. So she's happy about this, but she's not gushing about it. And the reason why I feel that she's not that fascinated is because when you read the letters she exchanged with her daughter Louise, for instance, the questions she has to Louise is always, what's leisure like over there? What's winter like? What do you do? I mean, tell me more about the landscape, and never really about the people. Or when the first world tour, she sent her son, her firstborn actually, to Canada in 1860. And you'd think, well, she's going to be excited about this. Well, no, first of all, she's reluctant because he's still quite young. And second of all, the only notes that I found upon his return is about, he brought us trophies and stuffed animals and photographs. And that was it, the collection of the artifacts, and not so much the people. So to me, this is a sort of a bit of a distant relationship, looking at it, fascinated by the landscape, but no warmth. And last but not least, I'm wondering if the first time she really saw a representation of Canada was probably for the Great Exhibition, 1851. Remember, they had stands for all the colonies, and there were several watercolors that were commissioned by Victoria and Albert to capture the moment in a way. And for Canada, when you look at the stand, there was a canoe dropping from the roof, lots of fur, like bear skin or something, and beaver fur. There was also a sleigh, and also panels representing winter scenes. And it's not visible in the actual watercolor, but I know that there was this lady from British Columbia who designed some watercolors of the Songhees, the Indian Songhees, in her backyard that were selected and probably displayed on the walls as well. So this is the sort of, the closest thing she got to Canada, artifacts, stereotypes. So this is the impression she had. I might be wrong, so maybe Jessica, your impression might be different, obviously.
I agree with you. I feel from all the research I've done, and my research does focus more on the 20th century, but with Victoria, I always get the impression that Canada was essentially the quote unquote safe colony. We had a lot of English, Scottish settlers, and there are some rebellions and there are some sticky moments, but overall, we're not really causing a problem per se. For Westminster, the government doesn't need to really worry about us. Although here in Canada, obviously, our government had several moments that were a big deal here, but in the UK, it's okay. They're pretty safe. We don't have to worry about them too much. And I always think that she's more fascinated by India and what that can bring to her. Like, in fairness, we did not give her an empress title. We couldn't do that. And I do think she's very much, she never seems, like Françoise said, she doesn't seem to care about the people here much. I think when people visit her, that when they go to England and they visit her, she does meet with them, and she seems, from what I've read, she does enjoy meeting them. But it's in that moment of, okay, this person has come to meet me. I am meeting with them. This is great. And then they go back to Canada or to wherever on their travels, and then it's done. I do think it's interesting, though, that she kept turning down invitations to come to Canada. I'm always stunned that Victoria traveled so little, actually, given the advances in technology and travel during her reign. But the fact that she did send so many of her children at various points to Canada, and I think the majority of her children had visited Canada, although Prince Arthur isn't Governor General until, 1911 to 1916, I'm pretty sure, so that's after her, but under George V. But I believe Victoria had originally suggested that, and then it took a while to actually happen. But I think it is interesting that she uses her children, much like she marries them across Europe. She also sends them across the empire to do tours and to kind of quote unquote, I always see it as a check-in and see, oh, is everything going okay? Like, what is it? Leave our business cards behind, make sure that they know that the crown is there and somewhat interested. And I think like Canadians are quite, or at least British settlers and descendants, because obviously when you go to Quebec, it's a very different story. And here in Manitoba, we have quite a large Francophone population as well. But in terms of English-speaking settlers, they have a very positive association with her. And as Françoise said, they're very interested in her. And even we have a 19th century fort here in Manitoba that's been preserved. You go there on field trips, etc. And they have many journals from the 19th century. And even I've looked through many of the ladies' journals, and a lot of them, it's months after the fact, but they're reporting on her fashion in the 1840s and the 1850s, and they want to know what she's wearing and like how can they emulate that here. So it is interesting. It in some ways seems like a one-way relationship, because I don't think she disliked Canada at all. I think we were just the safe choice. She never had to worry about us. We weren't as...
You were not Irish. You were not Irish. Because...
We were not Irish. We weren't as far as New Zealand and Australia. Yeah. So you can get here relatively quickly, and I use the term relatively. And while the Royals do travel across Canada, we see them focus more in Eastern Canada, which makes just travel easier overall, especially in Victoria's period. But I do think Louise is the one interesting kind of standout to me, because she actually left quite a mark on Canada. And it's so unfortunate. If listeners don't know, she actually ended up leaving Canada because she got hurt in a sledding accident. They sent her abroad to warmer climates to recover, which seems like a really nice option as I sit here in the cold. But Louise she left a very strong impression on Canada, and I think she was one of Victoria's greatest tools. I don't know if Victoria appreciated that. For my research, she did not, but Louise was one of her greatest tools. I think Edward Stuart, the Prince of Wales, he was very popular then also, although that's shorter. Louise was here for a few years, so she makes more of an impact. But she uses her children's star power to their greatest effect here in Canada. And I think she traded on that a lot here so she could put her attention elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, I don't love it. I'm sad that Louise has to return because she's hurt. But I love that it's in the very Canadian fashion that she's done a winter sport and has hurt herself, and that's why she has to go. Oh, it's really interesting.
She enjoyed the West. I mean, that's I've written in an article on how British women that decided to go in the mountains for the summer riding horses, they found their freedom. They were able to ride horses, not saddle, and there was something aspiring or inspiring maybe about the West. And Louise reflects that in her pages. So I'm sure she loves Canada. So if the mother didn't, she did. So
I like that to think that she somehow made up for Victoria's kind of, oh, it's cold there, isn't it? Oh, you get a lot of snow, and that's about it. I think Louise kind of makes up for some of that, goes a little bit deeper. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing to think how much kind of Canadian history is happening in the years that Victoria is queen. As you've both pointed out, it starts with a rebellion, and then we have Confederation, and then kind of the world has very much changed by 1901 when Victoria dies. And so it's interesting to see kind of purely in the length that she is queen, just how much the world changes, how much she changes the world, and how much the world changes her. And that's fascinating.
To add something to this story of interaction of Canada in her world, there's also the 1897 Jubilee, where she invites Prime Minister Laurier, Wilfrid Laurier, and his wife to come to England. And she, I don't know if it's she particularly, but more Joseph Chamberlain, probably, who's the master, puppet somehow, or the puppet master behind the Jubilee. But the Prime Minister ride quite close in the parade, actually going to St. Paul's Cathedral, to the Queen. I think it's like second or third carriage. And they have mounted police, riding as well. They're quite dashing in their red uniform. So somehow Canada has taken pride of place, I think, in that last celebration anyway. So
yeah, I think it's fascinating to see kind of all these stereotypes that we have now of it's always cold, it's always snowing, there are Mounties everywhere, everyone's seen a moose and a beaver, to think that those are the experiences that Victoria's also getting, which helps, I think, to collapse the time between her and us, and to see that actually this isn't that long ago, and that there's still so much that is similar, and so much kind of rightfully is different as well. So any kind of last thoughts that we have on Canada before we head to other parts of the empire? Or are we happy to go to warmer climates? Perfect. So let's head now to India, to Africa, to that section of the world. Françoise, why don't we start with you? What is Victoria's relationship with these other countries that are part of her empire?
Well, a lot of fascination, and also the fact that India and Africa, the involvement, the strong involvement, has to do with the second half of her reign, when she is going to take more confidence, I think, in also playing the real empress, or getting involved in every decision that are made. So she developed, I think, a fascination for India at an early stage in her life. When she was still a young child, she spent summers at this place called Claremont House, that was owned by her uncle Leopold. It was part of the royal family estate, and this house had belonged to Lord Clive of India, that actually never lived there, but he created the house for him and to showcase many of his artifacts after having spent a life in India. So there's this Clive room that she talks about when she visited Uncle Leopold over the summer. And that started, I think, her fascination for India. Afterwards, when she became queen, of course, there was always this need to interact with the governors, and eventually the viceroy after 1858. She knew many of them personally. She kept, correspondence with them. They sent her gifts, some of them sent them beautiful saris or shawls that she kept. Then she invited several Indian princes as well to Buckingham Palace for the jubilees, but also some of them just visited because they had the time to visit, I guess, and they always showered her with gifts as well. So that explains the collection, of course, of the ivory throne, the beautiful diamonds, the exotic animals that were found, in London parks as well, and servants, because she was also gifted with servants. So if you think of the second Jubilee, she received the gift of 2 servants, and one of them was Abdul Karim. Many of you have seen the movie, or read about Abdul Karim. And I think because Abdul Karim came in her life at this later stage, she was already a bit retired from the everyday business, but when she moved to Osborne over the summer, Osborne House on on the Isle of Wight, she was able to organize her life the way she wanted. For instance, by refurbishing one of the major rooms into a Durbar room, decorated with portraits of Indian people, including Abdul Karim, that has a huge painting of him in the Durbar room. She also had an Indian chef, so that she was served curries, that she almost every day complained one of the servants that worked for her. She wanted to learn Urdu. She asked Abdul Karim to teach her some Urdu lessons as well. She interacted with Abdul Karim's wife and his wife's sisters, I guess. There were several women living in a house next to Osborne, and they came regularly. She wanted to have the same saris, and so she was really surrounded, at least in the summer, by this crowd of Indian people in a way. So she eventually, brought India home in a way. This fascination for Africa is a bit different. I think she understood Africa a bit better by reading David Livingstone's report when he launched into his exploration of Eastern Africa, when he found the Zambezi Falls, which he called Victoria Falls. So she read that very carefully, and she thought, maybe we should bring a bit more of civilization to these poor African people, basically. So she was, convinced that conversion to Christianity of African tribes, that was the way to go. And she dedicated a lot of her energy, I think, to this idea of this gift of civilization, this white woman's burden in a way. And that was her plan, in fact. She was an expansionist at the end of her life, 100% for conquering new land, but always with the idea of Pax Britannica in mind. For her, that meant that whenever there was conquest, it was a gift, once again, to native tribes that were not able to understand each other. She would be bringing, or her officers would be bringing order, maybe civilization. They would settle the tensions, and that for the benefit of the colonized, if you like. She supported commercial expansion into Southern Africa, interacting with settled roads. She was in favor of a war against the Boer as well, Boer people, and she never understood why there was some rise of anti-colonialism in British India, why there was some violent uprising against British troops in the Sudan, for instance. Her heart went to, the people who died at Khartoum, and somehow the Boers' rebellions explain why there was a war for her. And the last anecdote I have to describe her fascination, I guess, different reasons for those fascinations for Africa, was on her deathbed. Joseph Chamberlain, who was then the Secretary of State for the Colonies, reported that she asked how her troops were doing in South Africa that day. So that was the sort of last words or last interest she had for the empire, and boom, she died, let's say. So that's the fascination.
It's amazing to think, as you're describing Queen Victoria wanting saris and wanting to have curries, is thinking this somehow doesn't fit with the image that I think popular culture often has of kind of this frumpy widow who's always wearing black and just there's no fun anywhere. And somehow this idea of a curry eating, brightly colored, sari wearing woman doesn't fit into that. But no. I think it's amazing how complex her own identity is.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think a son destroyed all proofs of interaction with Karim, and he thought his mother had gone berserk in a way, or was going weird as she grew old. So yeah, this was not understood by the rest of the family, by the way.
Yeah, there is. If anyone is either in England, coming to England, Osborne House, the Durbar room in Osborne House is beautiful. I was over on the Isle of Wight with some friends last summer, and it is amazing to think you are in the south of England, but you walk in and it very much has what you would expect to see in a room dedicated to India and to perceptions of Indian identity in Victoria's reign. Would highly recommend a visit. Mm-hmm. Jess, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts kind of building on what Françoise has said about how Victoria interacts with India and with colonies in Africa?
From what I know, it is more, she's much more interested in them. And I suspect it's probably also, like I said, Canada was safe. There's new things for her to explore. And I think it's also literally and figuratively, she's adding jewels to her crown. They're new things. And, as Françoise has said, empire and being an empress was very important to Victoria. It meant a lot to her. And obviously we view that differently now in 2023, but that was very important. So I think they're both interesting case studies, and they're not the same. And I've seen a lot of people kind of lump them together, but they are very different. And yeah, I find it fascinating.
It's always incredible. And I think I'll bring this up in a few minutes when we talk about how Victoria brings empire home, but just the influence of kind of the Indian takeaway is such a big industry in Britain. And we wouldn't have that without Victoria, and for good and for bad, without the empire. And so we've really been looking at how queens interact with their empire, especially how Victoria does. But how is Victoria's queenship itself affected by her status as queen of an empire, or in the case of India, as empress of parts of the empire? Françoise, let's start with you and then go to Jess.
It's hard to see if it's an interaction back, or if the fact that one of the first chapters I have is on becoming empress, which to me is a turning point in her life. I think she feels that she needs to become an empress in the early 1870s. She's now a widow, and she wants to continue, of course, her involvement in the empire like her husband showed her. But at the same time, she is marrying her kids to families, including her first daughter, who's going soon to become an empress, probably of Prussia. And there's this feeling of, maybe a small competition coming up. I don't know. But when you read her story as well, remember she was raised by a baroness who told her about the history of the world and global history of Europe. And one of the people she admires the most are Catherine the Great and Maria Theresa of Austria. So and you see those names cropping up again in the letters she exchanged with Benjamin Disraeli when she's trying to convince him that he has to talk to Parliament. He has to convince them they have to change the Royal Titles Bill. So I think she wants to compare herself to former empresses as well. So I don't know if it's really the empire interacting with her, or more like the idea that she needs to compete within Europe with other families maybe. And somehow becoming Empress of India is going to inflate her title in that sense. So I think she wants to be remembered not just as the Queen of England, because it's too limitative, but more really as a Empress of Ireland and India. So that's my impression. The interaction is more like, okay, how can I become big, and how can my name, in fact, who I am. So again, it's this egotistic approach, to the title.
Yeah, which I think again just gives us such insight into how the empire was understood. That for Victoria, it is very much, I will give directions, and I want to hear what's going on, but I'm still in charge, and I will interact how I want to interact, which is fascinating, historically speaking. And Jess, what about your thoughts?
I do agree. I think she it's not luck, but she lucked out in that she wanted to be empress, and this was a time when the British military and the British Navy and the British government conquered much of the world. So it worked out well for her, because I can guess that there are probably many monarchs throughout history who have wanted to spread their territories and or gain additional titles. That's probably not rare at all. But she lucked out in that her nation is doing that under her at the time when she wants it. So she wants an empress title, and they are able to make that happen for her. I think also before he dies, Alfred is also very pro-empire. And we see, and just I'll say as a Canadian, I blame them for the 1851 exhibition and for the image that everyone in Europe seems to have of Canada, that we're just like a ski hill and permanent winter. We have very hot summers. We have pretty much almost every climate possible. We're a massive country, so we have many things. But yeah, it's definitely affected by it. And it just worked out for her well.
Yeah, I think there is so much, as we say, these perceptions of countries that I think come with a British historical narrative. There's so much based on these Victorian perceptions of empire and of the people, the cultures. And so I guess the second half of this question might be, again, maybe a little more interesting or more fruitful, is how does Victoria bring that empire home? So we've seen kind of a little bit looking at Osborne House, and we've seen that Victoria doesn't necessarily kind of bring her empire into her queenship. But what are some of the physical ways that she integrates empire into her everyday life? Françoise?
All right. So, well, I mentioned the role of the Great Exhibition that Jessica just mentioned again. So I think that to her was she writes to her uncle Leopold to say this was the greatest day of her life. Well, it's only 1851. So, but I think she went to the Great Exhibition 24 times or something. So really she is into that idea of encapsulating colonies, into those stands and again, asking painters to make all these watercolors of the colonial stands. That to me is a way of keeping, close to her heart, in a way, representations of an empire she will probably never visit, because I don't think she loved traveling more than going further than the south of France at the time. But even going to the south of France was a big deal. So I don't think she was a great traveler. So that was the way of keeping it close to her heart. But I have other examples in mind when she's going to adopt literally people, like I told you about collecting people. There are several instances during the history of the empire when she comes across or rescues some young people, usually aristocratic boy or girl, because their fathers lost their title, their throne because of the empire. She's going to bring them to England. I have one example or two examples in mind. I have a young Sikh prince. He's the son of the Lion of the Punjab. Punjab was just conquered in 1848-49 by the British Empire, and the poor Julep Singh is left, in fact, without a throne. So Dalhousie, who's then her good friend and Governor General or Viceroy, he's going to say, well, can you take care of him? So she brought Julep to England, and Albert and herself looked after him, gave him a bit of money. They found a sort of pension. Dalhousie gave money as well. A pension was, found by the British Empire, gave money, or at least the British Parliament, and he was able to buy a beautiful home that was already turned into some sort of Oriental palace in Suffolk. And Albert and her and the kids visited Julep Singh throughout, the first years when he lived there, and he carried on his life, in fact, in England. So that was one of the way she rescued one of them. But again, he was an aristocratic. He was born from, the sort of royal family in India. So that's why, she had this sort of fascination for him. There's another example, or I call that pet project in my notes. I'm not sure that's the right word, but, it's about a little Ethiopian prince, whose father, was ruling over Ethiopia, was brought down, actually killed himself because he was conquered by the British. But the little prince Alimayeu, was left alone, in fact, with no parents, and brought back by a British military officer to London. And he was introduced to the Queen, who literally fell in love with a little boy and decided to become his godmother. So she found a bit of money as well for this boy to study and to live with this British officer. The poor boy died when he was 18 or 19, and she asked to have him buried at Windsor. So there are a number of other cases like that. I think 4 or 5, people or subjects that she sort of dotes on, and that she sort of build a project around them and rescue them and turn them into, most of them become Christians, obviously. And, she's teaching them civilization directly, but at least the empire is brought to her at this point. So these are the cases I have in mind that could be interesting to study further if you're interested.
I think it's just so interesting to see kind of the collection of people that she brings with her. And there's some sense of acknowledgement on her behalf there that actually the empire is destroying people's traditional power, and that it is very much a change of authority in every country of the empire. And it's interesting to see how she comes to terms with that as the person who is kind of supplanting everyone else's power. I think that's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. And as you point out, just being buried at Windsor, when you think of who else is buried at Windsor, that is quite an honor. And obviously shows how important this Ethiopian prince would have been to her to get that place of honor for burial.
Mm-hmm. But that's her Christian compassion, I think. And again, it's more like I call that pet project. I shouldn't say that, but really you feel that she's sort of getting besotted because, oh, well, poor little thing. And I don't think she cares as much for her own children as she does suddenly for these, downfallen colonial subject. And because they are born, from an aristocratic background, maybe she feels some sort of connection there. So after that, it becomes really psychological. And I don't want to end up, doing this sort of study, but honestly, you have to compare with your own children that she's not even that interested in her own kids. So, yeah.
It's always amazing, I think, to see just the differences in relationships and how they're different and why. And this really falls into that. Jess, how do you see Victoria bringing the empire home back to Britain, back to England?
So I'll just say, first off, I think pet project is a perfect way to describe it. It might not perhaps be the most positive, but I think it's a very accurate way to describe it. And just in terms of her, quote unquote, collecting people, and she definitely does, though it's not a Canadian thing. Again, I think because it's so many of her, essentially her own people. You don't need them. She already has them there. But I find it, and I talk about this more in the next podcast with Cindy, but I've always thought it's interesting how she kind of collects these aristocrats from around the empire, when at the same time the residential school system in Canada, which if listeners don't know, was the Church of England, the Catholic Church. There may have actually been a few Orthodox ones, although that I'm not sure of. And the government essentially took Indigenous children out of their homes to try and stamp out their culture, their languages, their traditions, and make them more British, essentially, and to make them better. So I find it a really interesting and heartbreaking juxtaposition in how that happens. And just also her relationships with her children are really, I find it really painful to read about because it just makes me so sad. And she doesn't seem to like them a lot. And I know that happens, but it's very striking, and just how positively and effusively she writes about other people. It's an interesting dynamic. But my own research in terms of how Victoria brings empire home, I've actually always looked at the more physical side. And so this speaks a lot about me as a person. I like to go through the Royal Collection Trust collections when I have time. And I like just put in a search term or a person and see what items in the collection are connected with them. And the amount of items that come from Canada during her reign is incredible, and just the wide variety. And it is actually surprising, but it makes sense as we've talked about how she feels. So many of the pieces are connected to different Indigenous groups, and how she it's an interesting, she's essentially building a museum of her empire. And obviously the Royal Collection started before her. She's not the only person to make significant additions, and she had such a long reign, so it makes sense. But she very much has physical pieces of the empire. And as you say, in Osborne, she essentially built herself a small Indian room, probably more. And so I find it's an interesting thing that she is known as being like the quintessential British monarch, essentially. A lot of people think of her, and she actually is trying to build what I see as like external to British setting around her. And again, I think the Great Exhibition, although it's quite early on in her reign, is a really good example of that. And I think Albert set the tone sort of in that we're collecting all of this thing, and I'll take it and say he was doing it with a positive intention, although obviously we again look at it very differently now. And with the colonizer settler kind of theory and how we look at the Great Exhibition really changes. Although I'll say, interestingly, I was reading work from a scholar in Canada, I can't remember who, talking about the Great Exhibition and how all the pieces, like, how were they taken from people in the empire? And like, were they just taken? Was it a questionable like business arrangement that they didn't have a say in? Did people willingly give it? And what range? Whereas in Britain, I've read a few things of scholars working on the British Empire and the Great Exhibition, and it still remains a very positive thing in Britain. The Great Exhibition is still seen by some as this very wonderful thing. And it is an accomplishment. Certainly, I'm not downplaying that at all. But it's interesting how differently it is viewed in Britain now and outside of it. And Joe, as you say, I find it fascinating how different the discussion about Victoria and empire is. And in Britain, with a lot of my colleagues in Britain, it is a very much, well, I'm dealing with this in Britain right now, but I'll deal with the quote unquote other later. Like, I will get to that. And it's just, we don't have endless amounts of time. And I've always kind of thought, okay, I have to make this a priority. They are a very big part of this story. And obviously in Victoria, the empire is a huge part of her story. It occupied much of her time. It seemed to occupy much of her thoughts. And it was a priority for her. And so I think we can't leave the people that make that empire up out of it. But in a lot of British scholarship, and I'd hope it's changing soon, and I've had some colleagues say, well, like, we have the entire British Empire to deal with. You're only dealing with Canada. We have to deal with all of these populations. Well, that is perhaps something that needs to be reconciled with, because the fact that there are so many nations who have this now contentious history with the empire is a difficult thing to sit with, but perhaps something that needs to be pushed further, because I've seen, like, as you've spoken with, and we have many colleagues that deal with different areas of the empire and different dominions, that we all have these very complex histories with the empire and with Victorian specific. And it can't be a one-way relationship of the quote unquote Dominion looks at it or India looks at it. We also need British scholars to engage with it as well.
Which I think is so exciting about your work, both of you. Sorry, that's the plural you. That both of your work really looks at both sides and looks at that kind of middle of the Venn diagram where both of these worlds are coming together, and how that interaction is so important and so complicated. And it's not just bad or just good, that there's all sorts that is happening in this period. And Victoria is at the center of it as queen. But even looking at that, how much her relationships differ from different places in the empire, how much her attention differs depending on the region, the future countries that she's looking at. And I think that's what's really exciting about this, is that we're getting to see those complexities and we're getting to see all of these nuances in a way that hopefully kind of gets people thinking about it, that empire is so much more than kind of, oh, well, now we have a commonwealth. It's so much more than just that.
Jo, I have a question for you. I'm just curious, what is the current kind of common perception of Victoria in the UK now? Like, obviously, here in Canada, if people don't know, and I think I talk about this in the next episode, in 2021, a statue of Queen Victoria was torn down during a march for when mass graves of children who died at residential schools were found. And so Victoria really does not have any sort of positive standing right now. So I'm interested to hear what is kind of the common perception in the UK.
I'm trying to think. I know obviously Kensington Palace is very Victoria focused. Osborne House that I was recently at is Victoria focused. But it does bring in some aspects of empire. I think on the whole though, the Victoria that we popularly see is the Victoria of British understanding, is the Victoria who's Empress of India and who has this empire and who is kind of the downcast widow. I think it's often in popular culture we miss how much authority she has. And I think one of the best ways to kind of summarize that is there is, where I live now on the bus route, there's quite an old building. It is pre-Victorian, but it is now home to the Queen Victoria Free House, so a pub, and it's also home to an Indian takeaway. And every time we go by, I just think the irony, but also just the historical reality that a British pub named after Queen Victoria and an Indian takeaway can occupy the same place. Like it's not
she would have liked that maybe. She would have liked that maybe. You know?
I wonder every time I go by. But I think the sense here is kind of Victoria is maybe not another Elizabeth II, but is one of those, she just is. She just exists because she was around for so long and she was part of so much history. But I will definitely be keeping an eye open in the coronation to kind of see how these discussions, and talking about the literal jewels that are brought back, of how those discussions about the crown jewels, about the roles of previous monarchs, how those get brought up, and I will report back.
That's what made me think of it, because I've done recent work on just the Kohinoor and the Cullinan, because very relevant topics, and I've noticed a little bit people are somewhat critical of Victoria, especially on the Kohinoor, and just how that all happened and how the royal family acquired that particular piece. But it's interesting to see just the sheer dichotomy of how quickly her image has changed here, to how it seems pretty standard there. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, I think, and I won't speak for the whole of Britain, I think popular images of her are starting to change. But I think they're a little bit, they're catching up to Canada. They're catching up to Australia. They're catching up to other places who are kind of going, hang on a second, she is not a 2D character. We have to flesh this out a little.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you both very much for such a fascinating conversation. Again, I knew the Canadian history sides, but I learned even new things about the relationship with Canada, and I learned so much about the relationship with India and with Africa. So thank you both so much for coming on and for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and sharing your insights into queenship and empire.
Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. And for our listeners who, like me, are incredibly interested in maybe this new to us part of the empire in India, the next episode coming to you from me and Annie Joseph is about Nawab Sikandar Begum, so one of the contemporaries of Queen Victoria, but looking at Indian queenship in a sense. So keep this conversation in mind as you go to listen to the next episode. So again, thank you to my guests for today, and I look forward to having our listeners back for the rest of our series.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.